with the national powers of treaty making, which is something that people don't discuss and address. Because it's nations that make treaties. Treaties do not make nations. But that's what's going on today. They're signing treaty agreements that provide them with the recognition of their self-government. Well, if you don't have government as nations to make treaties, you don't have any government at all. Now, when you look at the national powers of treaty making, that's an automatic recognition of the national sovereign powers of treaty making as granted to our nations and peoples by the Creator in terms of recognition of our sovereignty of our nations. So when you look at the national powers of treaty making, there's various forms of treaties. When you look at the treaty map that I just showed you, the center of the map of Canada is in white, and that's Treaty 1 to 11. And the pre-Confederation treaties on the East Coast and the Douglas Treaty on the Vancouver Island are in white. Why? They're in white because there's no laws giving them legal effect. So when you exercise your national powers of treaty making, you also have the duty and responsibility to give legal effect to your treaties under your government jurisdiction and law, and the other party to treaty, being the Crown and Right of Canada now, and the treaties that were signed before that were signed with the Crown of England and Ireland of the Empire of England, represented by the British government. But when you look at those national powers of treaty making, then both parties to treaty are required to give them legal effect under their government jurisdiction and law. And we took Treaty 6, where I'm from, to the UN and to identify the status of Treaty 6. They declared Treaty 6 being an international treaty. So that provides then the recognition of the international treaties 1 to 11, and the Pre-Confederation Treaty and the Douglas Treaty. And of course, there's the Niagara Treaty and others that are international treaties. But when you look at the colored part of the map of Canada, those are the modern day treaties that have been entered into by the nations, by the Indian nations and the Crown. And they're recognized as domestic treaties. Why? Because it's only one party that's given legal effect to those treaties. The James Bay Cree-Naskapi Agreement. There's the James Bay Cree-Naskapi Act passed by the federal government and the Quebec government. Nothing passed by the James Bay Cree, but they're now moving ahead with their own laws and jurisdiction to implement that treaty. So when we look at the national powers of treaty making then, and the form of treaties that have been entered into here in Canada, we also have the Jay Treaty. And the numbered treaties provide for the similar types of benefits to international trade and border crossing. That's supposed to be dealt with in terms of free border crossing by our people and by our economy. When you look at the specifics of how treaties are made then, I listed for you in a video on inherent rights. That includes our inherent rights to our sovereignty of our nations and the government, national powers of governing, the national powers of treaty making, the inherent powers of governing, respecting our internal, external, and international affairs, and it includes the inherent right of education, health, and social development, inherent rights to educate us, spiritual, cultural beliefs and practices. And it includes the inherent rights to an economy in terms of economic benefits. It includes the inherent rights to justice with our own justice system and our own inherent legal system. And it includes the recognition of our inherent rights to lands and resources, our citizenship and membership, to air and water, and so on. Now, when we look at the treaty making process, exercising the national powers of treaty making, how did our leaders go to the table? Well, first of all, you got to recognize that our nations and governments were engaged in treaty making long before any non-Indians touched the shores of Turtle Island. And we entered into treaties for various purposes, peace and friendship, various alliances of economics and military. Now, when they negotiated the treaties, they reserved all those inherent rights, inherent sovereignty I'm talking about. They're recognized, they're confirmed, and they're guaranteed by treaties. So now we have treaty rights. So we have the treaty right to education, the treaty right to health, the treaty right to social development, treaty right to lands and resources, the treaty right to water and air. That's included now in the jurisdictional arrangements. As a young leader, people used to laugh at me when I talked about the jurisdiction for airspace. Well, people are now not laughing at it anymore. When it comes to the environment, it comes to the national, international airspace using the technology and the air travel. And when we look at that process then of the recognition of treaties, we have the recognition of our governments controlling our citizenship and membership. So where is our Citizenship Act membership code? Now that's a critical document that you need to address because that will impact on how you get many of the people reinstated with full benefits and rights that they have. But you have to recognize that that's under the governments of Indian nations, the governments of the Métis Nation, governments of the Inuit Nation. And when we look at you're representing your people, there's a need to form some alliances with those governments of those nations so that your people get the proper recognition under their government jurisdiction laws for citizenship and membership. That can be done. The other thing in dealing with citizenship and membership, of course, we never deal with the dual citizenship status of our people. Yet every country has that, including Canada. So when we talk about that, then you see under the treaties, we have the jurisdiction for citizenship and membership under our laws, like I described. But Section 35(2) of the Constitution now provides for recognition of who? Of Indians, Métis, and Inuit. In what form? Constitutional recognition, not Indian Act membership recognition. It's a constitutional recognition. In what form? So I'm Saul Sanderson from the Chegastikation Band of the Cree Nation. And the Chegastikation Band of the Treaty of the Cree Nation entered into Treaty 6 at Fort Carlton in 1876, August 23rd. And we now have treaty status and treaty rights. But Saul Sanderson will be registered under the Cree Citizenship Act of the Chegastikation Band of the Cree Nation. I already have full status recognizing my status, my rights, and my benefits. Now, Section 35 applies on Saul Sanderson in what way? It's a dual citizenship status as a Canadian, but with full benefits. But they want to do away with the Indian Act? They can do away with the Indian Act, but I told them, you will have to amend your Citizenship Act with another part to your Citizenship Act that provides for the recognition of our jurisdiction for controlling citizenship and membership, but also for you to register our membership and our citizens under our laws and jurisdiction, governing who they are and what benefits they have. That has to be included in your amendment to your Citizenship Act. But those are options that are there, but to deal with your membership in terms of their rights and status, you need to have some type of an alliance with the governments of the nations, whether they're Indian, Métis, or Inuit nations, and that's where they need to accommodate the recognition of their citizens and membership with full rights and benefits. And if they need a dual citizenship clause in their act for citizenship, then they can do it. But you see, we're not going there. So in effect, what Canada has done now is they've exempted the people that you're representing from Section 35 too. They can't do it. It's a constitutional recognition. It's not an Indian Act recognition like they've been using to terminate people. So that's the type of issue you need to be prepared to deal with in terms of treaty implementation. Now, in the formal process of implementing treaty, then, and inherent rights, there's a formal process that you can implement. Inherent rights and treaty rights to education are collective rights, like I said, but they can be implemented through traditional contemporary education systems. Again, with unique and special laws in the form of a Traditional Contemporary Education Act that scopes out the total jurisdiction for education from kindergarten to 12 and for post-secondary ed for traditional trades and skills and professions, along with the contemporary trade skills and professions in post-secondary ed. That can always be planned and strategized through your plans to implement inherent rights and treaty rights to education. Now you can do that in every sector. You can do that in terms of implementing your economy. When we talk about implementing the economy, in terms of the powers we have for governing, there's a process that you can use to implement our own economy. And when we look at that process, this is a chart on how you would implement the inherent rights and treaty rights to health, to education, and in every sector of that economy, you'd identify your inherent rights and treaty rights in every sector, but you'd also identify your ownership and equity in every sector. If Canada wants to go to talk about resource revenue sharing, we can go there without formalizing and putting in place our own economy. That clearly lays out our jurisdiction and laws respecting how we implement them, and our own Trade and Commerce Act, and our own Corporations Act, and our own commerce, and so on. Now, a lot of what I'm talking about, you see, requires new institutions and structures of our governments. And that's where you have to look at your structure. And when we look at your structure, you're dealing with administrative structures right now. Only you need to look at the political organization and governing structures of AMNIS. And that'll give you more authority and more powers for governing and dealing with the issues that you have to address. So when we look at that process, you see, we'll need to be able to move ahead with implementing our treaties through those processes by sector. Now, when we move on then to deal with the treaty implementation, we reserve categories of lands that are not being addressed today. Under Treaty 6, we reserve 640 acres per family of 5 for an agricultural reserve or farmland. In addition to that, it says due respect having had to lands presently cultivated. As many of our people, Indians and Métis, were engaged in agriculture prior to treaties being made. Now, that's recognized as land that is ours already. It has nothing to do with the treaty recognition. It has everything to do with the inherent rights recognition and the benefits for agricultural benefits. When the lands are improved and occupied prior to treaty, they remain our land, whether they're Indians or Métis, and even the white settlers, the immigrants that had farmlands prior to treaties being made, they got recognized as having those lands already in place and cultivated, so they owned them, they said. Now, when they can do that for non-Indians, they can do it for the people that you represent too. Now, when we look at that whole process of implementation of those lands, it goes on in Treaty 6 to say, and other reserves. Now, what are those other reserves? There are fishing stations for occupying and use of the lakes and rivers. And when we look at the timber berths that are other reserve lands category, that's for shelter and for fuel and for habitat for the birds, the animals, the plants, the trees, and everything that provides for economic benefits and socioeconomic benefits in terms of livelihood. that's recognized by a treaty. And when we look at the other reserves, it includes your traditional lands and resource territory. Now, there's also the issue of the haylands that are in addition to the 640 acres per family of 5 for an agricultural reserve. So you have the special reserves that are spiritual, cultural grounds and lands, and you have your treaty sites that still remain our lands. So that's just some categories of lands that are reserved and recognized, confirmed, and guaranteed by treaty. And I could go on with the terms of the benefits of treaty and the rights under treaty, but we developed an inherent rights and treaty rights handbook. Many people talk about treaties, and it's not long to know that they don't know nothing about treaties. And they certainly never go to the powers of treaty making. And that code of silence again, you see, applies to what I'm telling you about right now. How many of your people know about treaty making, the national powers of treaty making, the treaties and inherent rights, the treaties and treaty rights? So that basically highlights for you the video on the national powers of treaty making, the treaties and treaty rights, and the connection between inherent rights and treaties and treaty rights.